So today we're going to do something really cool. We're going to dissect one of history's greatest superpowers right at its absolute peak, the 16th century Ottoman Empire. I mean, this thing was a machine, a true global power. But how did that machine actually work? Well, that's what we're here to find out. Let's break down its anatomy, from the very heart of the empire to the muscle that made it unstoppable.
You know, if you really want to get inside the 16th century Ottoman mindset, you have to start right here, with this one idea. The Sultan wasn't just a king or an emperor. He was seen as the literal pillar holding up the entire world order. Every command, every decision was considered divine will made real. This wasn't just about political power, it was sacred, it was absolute.
Okay, so having a godlike figure at the top is one thing. But how do you actually translate that into running a massive, sprawling, multicultural empire? I mean, how do you handle the day-to-day stuff, collect taxes from millions of people, and field an army that can conquer continents? That's the real question. That's the engine we're going to take apart today.
So let's start with the heart of this imperial body, the Sultan himself. He was the absolute, unquestionable peak of the pyramid. And just to give you an idea of what that looked like in real life, our sources tell us that even the Grand Vizier, the second most powerful man in the world, had to speak with his head bowed, never, ever daring to make eye contact. The entire state, everything, was designed to orbit this single immense center of gravity.
Right, so if the Sultan was the heart, then the Topkapı Palace in Istanbul, well, that was the brain. And you have to understand, this wasn't just a fancy royal home. It was the empire's living, breathing nerve center. This is where every major decision was made. In fact, the way the palace was physically laid out tells you everything you need to know about how power worked.
See, Topkapı was set up as a journey through three courts, moving from the public world to the sacred center of power. You'd start in the bustling outer court, which was pretty open. Then you'd move into the second court, the real engine room of government. But to get into that third inner court, that was the Sultan's private world. Only a tiny, trusted handful ever made it in. And to be inside was to be at the absolute core of power, because in this system, physical closeness to the Sultan was influence. Now, tucked away inside that inner court was the harem. And wow, is this one of the most misunderstood institutions in all of history? Western myths painted it as some kind of fantasy world of pleasure and indulgence. But the reality? Oh, it was so much more complex and, frankly, more interesting. The harem was actually a highly sophisticated political school, a center of power where women were trained in diplomacy, arts, and statecraft, preparing them to operate at the very highest levels. And the political power that came out of the harem was immense. You had the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, who was often one of the most powerful people in the empire, influencing policy and appointments. And then you get figures like Hürrem Sultan, also known as Roxolana. She started as a slave but rose to become the legal, official wife of Suleiman the Magnificent. That shattered centuries of tradition and made her an absolute powerhouse in her own right.
So while the inner court was all about personal, private power, the actual day-to-day grind of running the empire happened back in the second court, at the Divan, or the Imperial Council. This was the boardroom. Here, top ministers, led by the Grand Vizier, managed everything, from military campaigns to tax collection. And get this, often the Sultan himself would be listening in, totally unseen from behind a small grilled window. Imagine that, a constant, silent reminder of who is really in charge.
And leading that whole operation was the Grand Vizier. I mean, what a title, right? The Sultan's shadow on earth. That's how powerful this position was. You had guys like Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, who served 3 different sultans, basically running the entire state. Finance, the army, diplomacy, you name it. He was, for all practical purposes, a co-ruler. Which just goes to show you that this incredible administrative machine was just as important as the Sultan himself.
Okay, so we've seen the heart and the brain of the empire. Now it's time to talk about the muscle, the sheer force that made the Sultan's will a reality across 3 continents, the Ottoman military. And its strength wasn't just about having a ton of soldiers. It was rooted in an absolutely brilliant system that fused the economy and the army together. And at the core of that was the Timar system. Now here's the crucial detail. Unlike European feudal lords, Ottoman soldiers didn't own the land, they were just granted its revenues, its income. And in exchange for that, they had to provide a certain number of fully equipped cavalrymen called sipahis. Think about it. This created a massive professional army that was always ready to go, and it didn't drain the central treasury. It was basically a self-funding military machine. So clever.
The other pillar of the military was the davshirme, which is often called the blood tax. Every few years, the state would go to its Christian provinces, mainly in the Balkans, and levy a quota of young boys. They were brought to the capital, converted to Islam, and put through an incredibly rigorous education. The best of the best became top administrators. Some even became grand viziers. The rest, they became the empire's elite fighting force.
So these two systems created the twin engines of the Ottoman army. On one side, you have the Sipahis, the provincial cavalry funded by those land grants. On the other, you have the Janissaries, an elite infantry corps, the Sultan's personal guard, who were paid a salary directly from the treasury. Their loyalty was to the Sultan and the Sultan alone. This 1-2 punch of loyal professionals and land-based cavalry was almost unbeatable on the 16th century battlefield.
But hold on, Ottoman power wasn't just on land, not by a long shot. During the 16th century, their navy became so powerful that legendary admirals like Barbarossa, Harridan Pasha basically turned the Mediterranean into what some people started calling an Ottoman lake. And this wasn't just about winning battles, it was about controlling the incredibly valuable trade routes that were the economic lifeblood of the entire region.
If there's one single date you should remember to understand their naval might, it's 1538. At the Battle of Preveza, Barbarossa just wiped the floor with the combined fleets of the major Christian powers. That victory cemented Ottoman control over the Mediterranean for decades and projected the Sultan's power all the way from North Africa to the shores of Italy.
So you've got this incredible, well-oiled military and political machine at your command. How do you use it on the world stage? Well, Ottoman foreign policy was just as complex as its internal government. It was a constant dance of all-out war, clever alliances, and of course, very profitable trade. You can really break down their main relationships like this. With the Habsburgs in Europe, it was pretty much constant, high-stakes warfare for control of the continent. With a trading power like Venice, it was this complicated mix. Sometimes they were at war, sometimes they were major trading partners. But their rivalry with their eastern neighbor, Safavid Arayan, well, that was on a whole other level.
Yeah, the conflict with the Safavids was so much more than a simple border dispute over land. It was a deep ideological war for the very leadership of the Islamic world. The Ottomans saw themselves as the champions of Sunni Islam, while the Safavids were the great rising Shia power. This religious rivalry fueled decades of really bitter, intense warfare.
So, when you pull all these pieces together, the Sultan at the center, the palace is the brain, the army is the muscle, you get this picture of the 16th century empire as a perfectly tuned machine. People writing at the time really saw it as a golden age of harmony, a system where every single part worked in flawless balance with the others. One source from the time just captures this feeling perfectly. It describes it as a time when faith, the state, and the law all merged into the single breath of a great empire. That's a pretty poetic way of saying everything was in sync. This was their ideal, the belief that they had created a perfectly ordered society, all guided by the Sultan's divine will.
But here's the twist. As our sources point out, this golden age already contained the seeds of its own future problems. The very institutions that made the empire so incredibly strong, like the growing power of the Janissaries, or the complex, cutthroat politics of the palace, would, in time, become sources of instability and internal conflict.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating question to chew on. Was the 16th century Ottoman state truly a system of perfect order, the absolute pinnacle of a civilization? Or was this magnificent harmony just that, the highest point right before the start of a long, complicated decline? Something to think about.